and 1976, this stockpile built up in Israel to about 500 tons of uranium. The first part of this story is actually covered in Seymour Hersh's book, The Samson Option. What I do in this book is take it further. What happened in 1976 is the head of Israel's scientific intelligence agency, called LACOM, its Hebrew acronym, he contacted the Prime Minister of South Africa and said, essentially, we need this. And the South African Prime Minister, John Vorster, went to his Minister of Mines, Fani Botha, and instructed him to release the safeguards on the uranium. Now, there was a controversy within the nuclear science community in South Africa because many people saw this as a blatant act of proliferation and aiding the nuclear program of another country. However, the Minister of Mines flies to Israel in July 1976. This is just a few months after Vorster himself visits Israel. And the Israeli government in the last few days has responded to my allegations saying, we do not see any documents on Israeli letterhead. I have documents on Israeli Ministry of Defense letterhead showing the itinerary of Fani Botha in Israel in July 1976. Not only did he meet with Shimon Peres, he met with Prime Minister Rabin, the head of Israel's nuclear research community, and various other top generals in the military. The press passed it off as a discussion over new mining ventures, but people discussing new mining ventures don't meet with the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister.
Talk about the significance of Vorster.
Well, the significance of it is that Israel needed raw materials for its nuclear reactor at Dimona, and it had brought uranium in from Europe in the 1960s, but it was having trouble getting these resources, and South Africa had a lot of it, and a lot of it was already in Israel. So what I did is I went to Fani Botha a few years ago when I was in South Africa, and I interviewed him about this, and I'd actually like to read to you his quotation, which confirms that he lifted the safeguards and that the Israeli government had wanted to use this. He was well into his 80s at the time, and he told me that his counterparts in Israel thought that the safeguarded yellowcake could be very useful to them. And I quote, "I didn't sell it to them, I didn't give it to them, but when I became minister, they had it. They couldn't use it unless South Africa lifted them, the safeguards. So that's what I did." And then I asked him, do you feel that you may have been aiding the nuclear program of another country, perhaps furthering nuclear proliferation? And his response was, we worked together for some years. It was easy for friends to cooperate in this field.
And again, the quote was of
Fani Botha, the South African Minister of Mines in the mid-1970s. All of this came out in an in-camera trial that was kept classified in South Africa for many years. This leaked, and the transcript of the trial and the judge's own description of what took place in the proceedings, which involved many top officials, including future President F.W. de Klerk, reveals what I just read to you, the basic outline of the case, and that the Israeli government had been funneling money to Fani Botha in order to keep him in office until this deal went through. They wanted to keep him in his position as Minister of Mines because they knew he was sympathetic to Israel, and they were afraid that this deal might not go through. The trial records, interviews with lawyers involved in the trial, and the judge's own judgment confirm that through a middleman, the Israeli government funneled money to a South African government official in order to ensure that this deal went through.
We're talking to Sasha Polokow-Saransky, senior editor at Foreign Affairs. His book is called The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa. You write, Israel tested its own weapons and helped South Africa build highly advanced nuclear weapons delivery systems, long-range missiles throughout the 80s at a secret South African testing range where hundreds of Israelis were employed.
Yes, that's what I was describing earlier with this 1984 document. This lasted almost up until the transition to democracy in South Africa. As late as 1989, the two countries were still cooperating in this field. And interestingly, it was George H.W. Bush who started to crack down and eventually put an end to it. What happened in 1989 is Soviet and U.S. satellites picked up images of missiles being launched off the coast of South Africa from this testing range I described earlier. And the plume, the exhaust trail from these missiles matched the Israeli Jericho exactly. So CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency documents that have been declassified in Washington reveal that everyone in the U.S. intelligence community immediately saw this as a signature of an Israeli system or a technology that had been transferred to South Africa, or that there had been such close cooperation that the technology was essentially identical. And so at this point, Bush 41 reprimands Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, because this is 2 years after Israel has imposed its own sanctions against South Africa. Israel had vowed to sign no new arms contracts in 1987 after the U.S. government passed sanctions against South Africa and threatened to cut off military aid to any other country in the world that continued to sell arms to South Africa. 2 years later, missiles are being launched off of the South African coast that look identical to Israeli missiles. And so after 1989 and this discovery, the relationship begins to wind down. And by the time the transition begins in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela is released from prison and eventually becomes president in 1994, you see everything slowly disappear. And by 1994, there are no longer high-level military delegations going to Israel. The highest level South African delegation at that point is the boxing team, and they're going on a tour of Israel.
We talk about the Israeli generals, the relationship being so close that they would take South Africans to the front lines of the Lebanon War in 1982,
That's
the Israeli invasion of Lebanon.
That's correct. The South African general Constant Viljoen did travel into Lebanon with Israeli officials at that time. According to the documents in my possession, he did so before even Americans were invited by the Israelis to observe what the South Africans did. The other thing worth noting is that Constant Viljoen also went to the occupied territories in 1977, and he marveled at the Israeli checkpoint system and, quite frankly, was jealous of it. And he wrote in a report to the South African defense minister, "The thoroughness with which Israel conducts this examination is astonishing. At the quickest, it takes individual Arabs that come through there about 1.5 hours. When the traffic is heavy, it takes from 4 to 5 hours." And this was part of a document admiring Israel's internal security apparatus.
You have an interesting aspect of this story, which is the ADL in the United States, the Anti-Discrimination Committee. And we only have a minute to go, that we're going to post the rest of the interview on the website. What about the the Anti-Defamation League?
Well, essentially, during the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Anti-Defamation League employed a man named Roy Bullock, who was also on the payroll of South African intelligence. And this man was acting on behalf of South African intelligence and the ADL to infiltrate anti-apartheid groups in the Bay Area. And FBI files investigating the espionage involved came out later, confirming that he was essentially providing the same information to both the ADL and the South African government intelligence services, because they were concerned that the anti-apartheid movement in the U.S. was becoming very strong, and the Israelis and pro-Israel organizations in the U.S. were afraid that this was tarnishing Israel's international image.
Finally, we only have 15 seconds, but this history that was going on between Israel and South Africa, this relationship supporting the South African apartheid regime.
Yes, it was vital, and I would argue that it prolonged the life of the apartheid regime in South Africa. It was a vital link.
We're going to leave it there. Sasha Polakow-Saransky will continue at democracynow.org, senior editor at Foreign Affairs. His new book, The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa. That does it for our show. Happy birthday to Mike DeFilippo. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.